Hello, this is Dr. Tim Harrison. I am here at the Institute of Advanced Studies in Religion and Philosophy in Bristol, Virginia, also known as my crib. I am here to talk about the Old Testament, Lecture 2. I am joined here today by my graduate assistant, Emma. Say hello, Emma. There we go. Now, we are looking at the geography of the Old Testament. And while this may not seem to be very important, it actually does shape a great deal of what takes place in the Old Testament and shapes the history of the Israelite people, particularly the wars. One would only need to look briefly to see that the whole area is arid, desert-like, the Arabian Desert to the east, the Sinai Peninsula down to the south. The Sahara Desert covers the north of Africa, and there are a few rivers, and these rivers are very important because these make up the places where people will live and also where the roads will take travelers to. So the rivers and the wadis are very important in the Old Testament in this desert area. Now, the most important rivers is the Tigris and the Euphrates that make up the Fertile Crescent. You've probably heard of that in some of your other classes. They run into the Persian Gulf, and they make up sort of the center of this area, with Palestine being sort of a small part of it, with the River Jordan becoming important for travel and commerce later. Now, in this area known as Mesopotamia, the first people, the first civilization that we see rise are the Sumerians. The Sumerians lived along the Euphrates River and in that basin where the Tigris also comes down out of Syria. It was right at the base near what is called Basra in Iraq today. And they lived there. They were the first great city that we know of. And they lived here, but they were conquered much later by some other folk. Now, it's important, Sumeria is important. Not only did they have language and writing, but they established a city called Ur. And Ur is where Abraham later will come from. They are later conquered by the Elamites. Now, to the east of them were some Semitic people that are important. They are the Akkadians. The Akkadians also had a language, very important. Some people believe that Abraham was Akkadian, others believe he was Amorite. Now, Sargon, the first great king, first one to conquer and to take other land and develop an empire, is the first king of the Akkadians. And the Akkadians are Semitic, that's a language. And that's usually how people are put together by languages that they spoke. And so they're Semitic. And the Semitic language becomes important because that's where, of course, Abraham and the Hebrew people come from. We see the Amorites that come along later. They were known as Westerners. They lived west of the Euphrates. They were a Semitic people as well. Some people believe this is the actual people of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And they developed a pretty strong kingdom as well, but are later taken over by the Hurons. There's this constant rise of kingdoms and then falling of kingdoms. Remember, kingdoms were cities, mostly city-states that were ruled. Later, there was a group of people who come along around 1500 to 1000 BCE called the Hebrew. The Hebrew were sort of outlaws. Hebrew means wanderers, and some people believe the term Hebrew comes from the term Hebrew. And the Hebrew were quite often hired as soldiers, mercenaries for other kings. They served as slaves, which may give us a hint into the history of Egypt and Joseph. They were wanderers, semi-nomadic wanderers, which meant they would roam around and then they would bed down for a while in a place where there was grass and water and things for the animals to eat, and then they would move on. And this might be the beginning of the Hebrew people we know of as Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Another group of people that are very important and very interesting, they're the Hittites. And the Hittites were thought for a long time to be a made-up kingdom, a made-up people. There was no evidence of any Hittites. And so, interestingly, it was Bathsheba's husband who was a Hittite. And scholars thought, well, these Hittites, and they thought that this was a glaring weakness in the Old Testament, that they described peoples and kingdoms that didn't exist, and the Hittites were one of them. Well, lo and behold, many years ago, in the 1900s, the kingdom of the Hittites were found in Anatolia, known to us today, of course, as Turkey. And the Hittites actually did have a very large kingdom, maybe the largest kingdom and empire of its time, and they were a rival to the great kingdoms down in Egypt. And there was a great battle between the Hittites and the Egyptians in the plain of the Philistines, known to us today as Palestine, and that's how they became a part of the Old Testament history. Of course, Africa was very important to the history of the Hebrew people, particularly the Egyptians. Developed a long dynasty of kingdoms, and we know, of course, that for a while Abraham and his family went down to Egypt during a famine, and then later Joseph ends up there, and the Hebrew people, or his family, come down there to live, and there they grow. Now, this is interesting because we will see that there is a historical reference to the Hebrew, these people who come in to Egypt and eventually overwhelm the indigenous people of the area, and they become the rulers of Egypt. And many historians believe this is the story of Joseph. Also, interestingly, there's a group of people down to the south along the Nile River in what is present-day Ethiopia. They were the people of Cush, and Cush was thought to be the father of a great warrior of that time, Nimrod. And the Cush people at times would push themselves up into Egypt, and they also ruled Egypt for a while. So Egypt, when we talk about the pharaohs, the kings of Egypt, it's interesting to note that it may be a different group of people than you're thinking. It wasn't just one people at one time. Sometimes it was the Hebrew, the Hebrew people. Sometimes it was the Cushites, who were African. And then sometimes it was indigenous people who we would think of sort of as present-day Middle Eastern people. There's also people who live along the coast called the Phoenicians. The Phoenicians are the first people to develop what we call today money. They called it specie. And they became very, very rich because they developed a means of dyeing cloth with a purple dye that that only they had. It came from clams along the coast there, along what is present-day Lebanon. And they would sell this cloth. It was a very royal purple. And that is why royal purple is called royal purple. Only the rich and the great people could afford it. Now, these Phoenicians later on leave the coast. They're sort of pushed out, and they establish a great city on the north of Africa in what is present-day Tunisia, called Carthage. And they were a very great and wonderful people. And these Phoenicians we see all through the Old Testament because Jezebel, the bad girl of the Old Testament, she was a Phoenician. Now, Palestine is very important. Palestine is a word that actually means the plains of the Philistines. The plains of the Philistines becomes the plain of Palestine. And it becomes important because it's a roadway from the north to the south, from the Hittite kingdom and the Babylonian kingdom down into Egypt. Many battles are fought along it, and later Solomon will use this place as a means of commerce because people went through this way in order to get to different places. It afforded them water. It was easy to travel. And Solomon uses this in a very effective way to become very rich. Now, the areas that you need to know of in Palestine that's important to the story of the Old Testament. The first is the coastal plain, Palestine, and Mount Carmel at the top. This is what I was talking about. This is where the Philistines lived, and that's why it was called the Valley of the Philistines, or the plain of Palestine later. Then there's the Central Hill country. This is the mountainous area where actually the first Israelites, when they came back from Egypt, this is where Joshua took them and they lived. And they lived here because it protected them from the Philistines. And then there's the Negev desert in the south, which we see that David used very effectively when he was hiding out from Saul, and also the Sinai desert as well. And then we see the Jordan Rift. This is where the Jordan River went down, and it provided water, fresh water, for people to live. There was a sea at the top of it. We know it later in the New Testament as the Sea of Galilee. It went by a couple other names as well. And then the Jordan River, and then that empties into the Dead Sea. The Dead Sea is full of minerals and salts that makes it dead, and animals and plants don't live around it. Then there's a Transjordan Plateau. That's on the east side, sort of the east side of the Jordan River. And this is where Moab and Edom will be. And these are, of course, are the cousins of the Hebrew people, and also, like most cousins, the people you fight with most of the time. The Way of the Philistines, going down the coast, is a place where, as I said, many battles took place. Invasions came up through this way, and it was a place where it's very difficult to fight if you don't have a large army. That's why so many people used it as a means of getting to the Israelite people. The Romans referred to it as the Via Maris, or the Way of Mars, because there's so many wars up and down that way, and this became known as the King's Highway. And as I said, Solomon used it very effectively for commerce and for building up his kingdom. That's this week's lecture. I hope you enjoyed it. Hope you enjoy this week, and I will see you next week.